Good morning. It's evening here in California, and I'm delighted to be invited to join this conference, the NBMC, and to talk about my favorite subject, business ethics, and where it's going. And so that will be my purpose for the next few minutes. I will speak for about 20 minutes and then leave plenty of time, the rest of an hour, for conversation. And so I'm looking forward to getting into being pressed on the issues that I'll be discussing. I have been delighted to visit Manila a number of times and to participate in conferences there at Ateneo de Manila, and have met many of you from the other universities and colleges throughout the Philippines. So it's an honor to be again invited to participate. I have to say that looking ahead to the next normal involves looking beyond the pandemic, but in the United States, thinking about ethics and the next normal, it also involves looking beyond the presidency of Donald Trump. With Joseph Biden becoming president of the United States, there are many questions raised about how we rediscover some of the ethical norms which have been eroded in recent years. And so I've been giving talks at a number of venues about recovering our ethics after Trump. And that isn't the topic of tonight's discussion, but it is a very difficult question because a culture takes on a set of norms. And just like a corporate culture takes on a set of norms, so also do national cultures. And so the influence on the national culture of the United States by this presidency, which will end on January 20th, I believe has been quite damaging to our values and ethics. And so we will be engaged in the next normal, in the recovery of those values and ethics. Tonight, this morning for you, I'd like to talk to you about part of the next normal, which is getting control of corporate misconduct. Perhaps it's because I've consulted with so many organizations, primarily companies, and partly because I've taught thousands of students over the years at Stanford and at Santa Clara, and I've had an online business ethics course taken by about 25,000 people. So I worry about whether I've had the kind of impact that I would have hoped from that work. And being self-critical, I don't think we have headed off this spate of misconduct scandals involving business. And therefore, I've been doing a lot of deep thinking with my co-author, Mark Epstein, formerly a professor at Harvard and Stanford, INSEAD, and Rice universities. We've been thinking, because we're both at the same stage in our careers and intend to work on a continuing basis on the subject of business ethics, we've tried to understand why misconduct continues and what we might do about it today. And I believe this is a very important subject for the teaching of business ethics. So that's why it's the topic that I'll talk about this morning. So I'd like to start my slides at this point, and I'm hoping that I can do that if everyone is ready. All right, and I just need to get back to the beginning. There we are. Good. So the topic I'll be talking about for 20 minutes will be corporate misconduct, why it continues, and what to do about it. The subtopics I want to deal with are why misconduct is a concern, why it's a problem we should be concerned with, how have we tried in the past to control corporate misbehavior and misconduct, why does it occur, what efforts to control it have failed, why the efforts to control it to date have indeed failed, how we might now reform the ethics efforts of corporations to be more effective in heading off misconduct, and how we might reshape business ethics courses to make a contribution to heading off misconduct. And finally, some citizen action things that can be done to control misconduct. So I'll run through each of these subtopics quickly. First of all, why is misconduct a problem? Well, first of all, it's that the frequency of scandals has certainly not lessened and may even have been greater than in the past. The scandals, I think what's different today than perhaps 10 or 20 or 30 years ago is that the typical scandal does much more damage than it used to. That's partly the scale of much of business enterprise today, but it's also just the interconnectedness of the world, and therefore the damage that's being done is much greater. Respected companies have had scandals, and the litany of companies of Volkswagen and Wells Fargo Bank and others, which I'll get to in a moment, it's breathtaking because it involves companies that were long considered our best companies, and one would expect better conduct from them. It's important because we've spent so much money and exerted so much effort to control misconduct, and yet it's failed. The business ethics courses, I created the first business ethics courses at the Stanford Business School when I went there in 1978, and I worked to create ethics centers and programs in different academic settings, and I worked with a lot of companies, and yet all of that seems to have failed. So that makes this a concern, and a concern particularly for business professors. I think this pattern is dangerous because it undermines the free market system and raises many more skeptical attitudes towards capitalism and the free market system. As a believer in the free market system, a business professor, I don't want to see that confidence and trust so eroded that we begin to throw out the free market system in substantial ways. And finally, I think it's important because in some ways it is a sign of our failure as business teachers or business ethics teachers to inculcate in our students a sense of honor and a sense of ethics. Here, this is just a quick accounting of some of the recent scandals. And this is just a sampling. In the new book that we've done on corporate misconduct, we have more. And most of these, we have case studies about them. But this is a selection you take. Obviously, the Enron scandal in the United States gathered a considerable amount of attention 19 years ago. But if you just look down at the names of the companies involved, you realize that these are amongst our most distinguished companies, and therefore one has to be troubled by the fact that these continue. We'll talk about some of them as we go forward here. So how have we tried to control misconduct? It seems to me that particularly in a country with a such strong religious tradition as the Philippines, and within the Jesuit tradition that I've been teaching for much of my time in the United States, ethics and the values of individuals have been a primary technique that we've used and expected to control misconduct. We expect people to have a sense of honor, to be honest, and yet they've disappointed us so much. Families, schools, and churches, we've looked to inculcate values, and yet there's some questions about that. We've relied on laws and regulations of all kinds, but we've learned some limitations of laws and regulations and what they can accomplish. We've looked for CEO leadership, and yet in too many of the scandals, the CEO himself or herself is the very source of the misbehavior and misconduct. Corporate ethics programs, starting in the United States in 1986, corporations have had formal corporate ethics programs. By about the year 2000, virtually all large corporations. And yet those don't seem to have had the impact that they were designed to have. business school courses and external ethics training. Much of my career has been teaching ethics in business schools or teaching ethics in corporate programs, particularly with executives. And yet, many of the people I've taught, both in my MBA classrooms and in the corporations, have later been implicated in misconduct. Corporate self-regulation. Corporations often argue that if they'll just be allowed to engage in self-regulation, it would work out much better. And yet our experiments with that have not, in general, succeeded. Social activism, there are many movements to try to reform business, many of them well-designed, many of them very naive in their attempt to try to change corporate behavior. And to some extent, a few of them have been successful, the movement for ending apartheid in South Africa and several others, but they simply have not addressed the broad concerns around misconduct. And many of us, I suspect the faculty who are on this call, have been engaged in trying to build the business case that ethics is indeed profitable or not incompatible with profit. And yet that business case has often not convinced business people, whether it's valid or not. It hasn't convinced business people to engage in behavior which is not improper and misconduct. So these are the ways in the past 50 years that I've been having a career in business ethics, we have tried to do this. So why does corporate misconduct occur? My co-author and I, Mark Epstein, did a lot of thinking over the last 5 years, and we were using this metaphor, which we think is very helpful to understand how misconduct arises. Corporate misconduct is due, I think, to one of three things. One is individuals, the bad apple, that a certain percentage of employees and executives are simply unethical, serve only their own interests, are glad to cheat and to misrepresent things. And that's one hypothesis, and certainly is borne out in a number of the scandals. The bad barrel is the corporate culture. Some cultures, corporate cultures, tolerate and even reward, incent misconduct. Wells Fargo Bank is my favorite example. It created a sales incentive system that virtually guaranteed that the salespeople who were on the telephone were going to misrepresent what they were selling and then create fake accounts. They did, and so many of them did, that the company ended up firing 5,300 employees. And believe me, there were not 5,300 bad people in Wells Fargo. It was a corporate culture that led otherwise good people to engage in misconduct. And then the bad orchard, and this is where I think we're making a contribution in this particular analysis, that we've got to think strategically that some competitive environments are corrupt, some competitive environments make it difficult to operate ethically, and companies need strategies for coping with those difficult cultures or settings. Some of them are nations, some of them are industries that are neglect all environmental concerns, perhaps, whatever. So at least in our look, 50 to 100 scandals, each of them can be placed in one of these categories or perhaps in two of the categories. So I think this gives us a help in understanding why misconduct occurs. Now, why have the efforts to control misconduct failed to date? For the bad apple, companies simply don't identify and act quickly enough to deal with bad apples. They don't do a good job of screening them on the way in, and you get some ethically very misguided people hired into organizations. They don't detect them quickly enough. They don't deal severely enough with them. And in some cases, of course, the CEO who's running the company is the bad apple, and that makes it very difficult. And we see poor governance practices making it impossible to really deal with many of those CEO bad apples. In terms of efforts to reform the bad barrels, CEO leadership and very firm ethics programs have not been effective to date. And there are a wide variety of reasons. I'm going to talk about some in just a moment. But in general, corporate ethics programs have been a relative failure in dealing effectively with misconduct. The bad orchard, companies don't often recognize the nature of the corrupt and difficult environments they operate in, and therefore don't develop good strategies to sustain their ethics in those environments. So that's why I think in general, we have not dealt effectively with misconduct. So I've got 2 slides here with 10 recommendations to companies about what they might be doing. There is a discussion about corporate purpose going on now in the United States, and the need to redefine corporate purpose in both economic and social terms. Most companies, most large companies particularly, define their purpose exclusively in economic terms. And to me, that is inevitably going to lead to ethical compromises. And so I look to companies rethinking that and taking very brave and strong stands to define their corporate purpose, both in terms of economic and social purposes. The B Corp movement, Public Benefit Corporation movement, is one of the organizations which is promoting that redefinition of corporate purpose. Then you have to create purpose-driven business strategies. If you're a pharmaceutical firm that is trying to alleviate human suffering, which would be a good social purpose, then you need to be choosing the drugs you develop in part based upon not just their potential for profitability, but also their potential to save human lives, to alleviate suffering. Thirdly, you've got to create a different tone at the top, genuine moral leadership. I think by any measure, the number of CEOs who exhibit that is relatively small. They are pressed by the push for profitability, but too many of them succumb to that and don't exert real moral leadership. The fourth recommendation we have is that you need to take the responsibility for purpose and ethics and drive it down to the middle management. In many organizations, there is an understanding of ethics, which is just this affects the top and this affects the bottom, but the key role of middle managers is ignored. And so we believe that there has to be a very different kind of ethics program and initiative that places line accountability for ethical behavior. You have to hold, for example, at Wells Fargo, the managers of that sales force to account for the fact that there was such a bad culture. And if they were responsible for the ethics in a much more formal way, I think things could have been different. The fifth, expand the portfolio of the corporate ethics officer to include macro ethics issues. This is one of my favorites. Very often, the chief ethics officer is only asked to weigh in on what I consider to be the less important ethical questions, not those that involve, shall we enter a joint venture in Russia or China, or not, whether we should start a new division that deals with some ethically problematic products. They are not brought in to strategic questions, macro ethics questions, only to micro ethics questions. And I think that's a failing of the top leadership process in most organizations. So I have 5 more. Transparent and safe environment on ethics. Despite all of the effort to protect whistleblowers, still in most organizations, there is a fear that if one raises ethical questions, they will be, they'll pay a price for it. And so you don't get people raising their understanding of what's going on early enough, and therefore a small scandal becomes a big scandal. The seventh, there isn't a regular process in most organizations for looking at the incentive plans and the systems and see if they create incentives for people to behave in good ways or bad ways. Clearly in the Wells Fargo case, when they designed the sales compensation system, they did not look at what that impact might be on those salespeople. And very rapidly, they felt enough pressure that they began to cheat. The eighth recommendation that we've come up with is that we think there's the need for companies to have very strong systems for identifying, anticipating the ethical impacts of companies' operations and the risk that the company runs. And so in our book, for example, we present 3 instruments. One is a backward-looking measure of corporate ethical performance, a forward-looking measure of corporate ethical risk, and then a third instrument which allows you to look at individual scandals and understand whether they're serious or not, whether they should raise substantial questions about reform of the management of the organization. Obviously, board accountability, number 9, is important. Very few boards take seriously their responsibility to oversee the ethics of the organization. Much more frequently, that's left to staff, and then it's delegated down in the organization to an ethics officer who often doesn't have enough of the ear of the senior management. So board accountability is really critical. And then there are some specific reforms around existing ethics and compliance programs which flow out of the first 9 recommendations. One of them is a whole new kind of training program for middle managers about what having accountability for ethics really means. Okay, how do we reshape our business ethics courses? Here's my suggestions. We can go into these if we want during the open forum. I think we have to teach the debate over corporate purpose. There is such argument about, is the purpose of the corporation just to make money, or if it's to do social good as well, or to hold itself to ethical standards? How do you balance those, and how do you put that into practice? We need to teach the origins of good behavior. Why do people generally behave well? Is it their personal values? Is it a good corporate incentive system, thoughtful creation of a corporate culture, and obviously the origins of bad behavior? Among one of the areas that's emerged in the last few years is the study of behavioral ethics and the way in which we have perspectives on ethics which don't necessarily serve the public as well as it might. We need, one of my great concerns is I think there are predictable or unavoidable ethical dilemmas for every new employee, for every middle manager, for every senior manager. And I think the cases we select to teach ought to illustrate how here's a dilemma that every new employee might face. Just to give you the example, being asked to do something which the new employee knows is not right, is unethical in some way. And we know that that occurs with a very large percentage of new employees, is that they get seen as the fall guy and expected to do the dirty work. And so on. But unavoidable ethical dilemmas, we can list them. My next project is actually a series of 3 books on ethical dilemmas of new employees, ethical dilemmas of middle managers, and ethical dilemmas of senior executives. I think we need to teach examples of genuine ethical leadership, people who got it right, perhaps who chose not to make payoffs in particular situations, people who created human resource policies that really favored their employees in the time of pandemic for example. And there are some good stories out there to tell. We need to teach the elements of an effective corporate ethics program. Again, in the book, we go in some detail to what the elements have been to date, what needs to be added and changed. And then we need to teach the concept of ethical risk and tools for identifying it. We need to help people say, if we're going to enter, I was working with one company that was suddenly going to enter in a big way China. And the question was, what kinds of risks were they running and how could they mitigate that risk? That's the kind of thing that occurs every day as companies think about new kinds of incentive programs or new business initiatives. So I think those are some of the ways that we can improve our teaching of business ethics, but it's not just those who teach business ethics. It's also those in accounting and finance. My co-author, Mark Epstein, is an accounting professor and has done all of this work within the teaching of accounting. And it's equally applicable in marketing, in finance, in operations, all of the work around AI and ethics, and so on. So these are topics that really ought to be addressed in every business course as we look at how to sustain ethical behavior and avoid misconduct. Just here's citizens' actions. I think we can encourage our students to engage in, shop and work for the most ethical companies, vote with their feet and with their pocketbook, be a change agent within the organization. The concept of being a social intrapreneur is catching on. Support laws and regulations to control misconduct. Companies supporting laws and regulations. Increasingly in the last few months in the United States, a large number of companies have come out for reforms related to racial practices and racial justice. And maybe that's in part because we've had such a negative example in the White House in national leadership. But companies have become quite strong in their support for laws and regulations and their advocacy of good practices on racial questions. Scrutinize corporate conduct, praise and criticize. I think it's important for us to call out misconduct when we see it, praise good conduct when we see it. And one that's of particular interest to me, maybe because I've had a number of consulting opportunities in this, how do you handle a scandal which has occurred responsibly? Obviously, being concerned about the victims first, finding out why it occurred and where the system failures were and so on, and then being highly transparent in how it's dealt with. And I think the press and the public need to demand that kind of good practice. So in summary, I think we have the tools to control and reduce the impact of corporate misconduct on society, but only if we take seriously reforms in how companies operate, how we teach it, how we create and incubate values in our families and our schools and so on, and how we act, how we behave as hopefully good citizens in the process. Now, this is the book that we've just completed. Its formal publication date is in January. We've priced it very cheaply because we're not trying to make money off it. We're just trying to get these ideas out there about misconduct. And finally, there are a variety of questions that I hope you engage in discussion with your peers in your business schools. We might have some of that in the next few minutes here, but what does cause bad conduct? What does cause good conduct? How can individuals reduce their own misconduct so that I don't inadvertently or maybe deliberately harm others? How can companies structure their incentives and their ethics programs to reduce misconduct? What can society more generally do? And of course, how can these topics be taught effectively in business schools and other educational settings? I'm going to stop there and look forward to a conversation with Professor
Kirk, thank you. That was a wonderful, one of your most brilliant presentations I've heard. And I've heard many, and they're, I wanted to commend particularly how concrete and actionable the presentation was, and that you finished doing
Thank
that
you.
in 25 minutes. So that was wonderful in that regard. I'm surprised that the book is coming out Jan 2021, but I wanted to inform the audience that the book is in fact already available on
Yes.
Amazon. So I was able to download this several weeks ago. Again, the title of the book, I'm not going to earn from advertising the book, but I really just enjoyed reading it. The title of the book again is Rotten: Why Corporate Misconduct Continues and What to Do About It. Kirk, I wanted to address the audience now at this point. It's wonderful that you gave a short presentation to give an opportunity for the audience to interact with you. So I wanted to tell our participants that you should take advantage of the time that we have with Professor Hanson in order to interact with him, and not just to ask questions, but to be able to interact in a fruitful way. But to begin that interaction, I wanted to ask you about your experience in writing the book. Kirk, can you narrate an anecdote about your experience when you were writing the book? Perhaps I'm hoping the anecdote can be an inspiration for aspiring business ethics faculty to write their own books. So any anecdotes about writing the book?
Well, this book is deliberately not a strict academic book, but it is a book designed to try to influence how people approach a problem. And so you'll be amused by this. My co-author and I had about half of the footnotes prepared for the book. And then we looked at each other and said, now this is going to take many, many, many hours to fill out the footnotes. Is that the kind of book we want, or will that put off some of the corporate people that we hope will read the book? And so we chose to say 50 years of his work in this field, 50 years of my work in this field. We will present that as our evidence and our support for being pontificating as we have in the book. But that's one anecdote. Let me give you one more. And that is that both of us, Mark Epstein retired from Rice, and I retired from full-time work at Santa Clara just a couple of years ago. And on reflection, the reason we started this book was we were both reflecting on 48 years or 50 years of a career. And we said, you know, we didn't solve all the problems of the world. We both of us had active teaching careers and active consulting careers. And we saw many of the companies we worked with get engaged in scandals thereafter. And we saw so many distinguished companies that previously had good reputations get caught in scandals. And so we really came to believe that if not us, somebody ought to sit down and ask some hard questions about why corporate misconduct continued. And so in the book, we've tried to present some simple charts and some ways of thinking about this that could also be useful for teachers as they talked about this with their students. So you'll find a lot of bullet point lists and exhibits with numbers 1 to 6 and 1 to 10. And so we hope that will help change the nature of the discussion.
Yeah. Thank you. There's a question from Bobby Olarte, who's a Doctor of Business Administration student. He asks, when you talked about why misconduct is a problem, you were self-deprecating on behalf of our profession as business ethics teachers when you said that the business misconduct is a sign of our failure as business teachers. Can you tell us a few stories to depict how a business teacher can otherwise succeed in preventing misconduct? I mean, besides at least some concrete stories or anecdotes about based on your recommendations about how to improve our courses.
Well, first of all, I don't think business professors are the only ones responsible for the continuing scandals in business. And there is a limited amount one can do in a course on business ethics, or in taking something like a course in accounting and adding some of this material. You're not going to change someone's core values in a course. What I hope we do in courses is, I hope, number one, we present the notion that it is legitimate to act with integrity and with ethics. And you don't have to go into business assuming that you have to do whatever to make profit and that that's your role for the corporation. I think there are many young people who come out of business schools who make an assumption that you've got to lie, cheat, and steal to get ahead. We want to, I think we can hope to communicate that as strongly as we can. We need the deans, the college presidents, and the institutions that we're a part of to communicate that indeed this is a legitimate way of acting as a business person. The endorsement by business schools of serious endorsement of courses on business ethics, or having speakers who come and talk about the difficult problems that are faced in a corporation around value questions, dealing with employees or whatever. Those are all signals that people can indeed grapple with those questions legitimately. The other thing I'd say is that we also provide some very practical help to people who want to act ethically in giving them strategies to do that. And so with the cases that we choose, or with the techniques that we describe, we're trying to help people say, there are ways of raising ethical questions that don't immediately put your job at risk, but can help you bring about change. The notion of the internal social entrepreneur. There's a lot of discussion. John, I know you're familiar with it. Mary Gentili has this material around giving voice to values. And that's her primary concern, is how can you raise an ethical question, raise information about misconduct in the context of a company and not get stabbed in the back? How can you do it and keep your job?
Yeah. Kirk, one of the things I learned from you from before is the difference between the need to convert those who need conversion and preaching to the choir. There's a difference between that. And the important difference is that we should be wise in devoting our time, whether or not we should devote our time to converting people who just want to make a quick buck, so to speak, and be opportunistic and lie, cheat, and steal just to make the quick buck, the proverbial quick buck. On the other hand, to also find like-minded individuals to collaborate with and to work towards genuine change. So that's why I liked when you mentioned the citizen action to control misconduct. You mentioned change agency, and that we should form people to conversion or some sort of not just convert themselves, but to be able to convert others.
Yes.
In this regard, Kirk, I'm thinking there's a question from JR that's related to this distinction. JR there, Gatos asks, is corporate misconduct related to an individual's upbringing? So it has. I think he's calling attention to a person's values and a person's character in that regard. And he's asking, are there any problems? Are there any solutions? Let's assume for a moment that JR is from Human Resource Management Department, and he's asking, are there any hiring procedures to perceive, to assess an individual's upbringing? And is that a valuable intervention strategy?
Well,
it's
think,
about hiring, I think.
Yeah. Right. We actually provide a few examples of what might be done in hiring in the book, because that is, I think, he's exactly right. He or she is exactly right. This is a critical question. Well, first of all, I think you have to take seriously the notion that you're screening both for the ability to perform economically, but also for the values that the individual brings to the organization. And I think a few companies are starting to do that. We in Jesuit institutions and others in Catholic business schools often get the feedback, hey, I like hiring your people because I can have greater confidence in their values. And so I think, we kid, well, they should only hire people from Catholic universities and business schools. That's not going to come about, but they should be asking questions that reveal something about the values of the individual. And they should take seriously their concerns about the values of the individual when they're making their hiring decisions. Right now, it's simply not a concern in the hiring process at all. One would hope that it would. There are a variety of interviewing techniques people use to get at those. There are even pencil and paper, what are called integrity tests. I don't happen to have much confidence in those, but one should at least try to probe. One of the things I've heard one manager say is that she always asks a question about values and said, give me an example of when your values and those of your boss or the company that you have worked for in the past have conflicted, and how did you handle it? And, it isn't to discover, scandals from the past. It's just to understand whether the individual knows and recognizes when there's an ethical conflict and has some kind of approach to deal with it that might be productive.
Thank you. Yeah. Kirk, I like that we pay attention to the scandals. Can I ask in this regard that, well, you assess business ethics practice as a failure, and I think the scandals are clear evidence for that. But can we also talk about successes? Can we also talk about exemplars and what
Yes.
makes them successful? Maybe we can use the good cases as good teaching examples as well in our classes. So do you have any anecdotes of successes and how interventions have succeeded?
Well, first of all, I think we help prepare students by talking about the unavoidable ethical dilemmas they are going to face. If we can give them a heads up, early warning about what they're going to face, we can help them navigate some of those very difficult first ethical challenges that they will face. I think when we do that, that is of great success. I've taught an executive seminar for leaders in Silicon Valley for 30 years now, and I have a set of 20 unavoidable ethical dilemmas of leaders of organizations, business, nonprofit, civic, mayors, and other officials. And I get lots of feedback from them about, the fact that we talked through how you would face that kind of dilemma. It happened to me the following week, and I was able to deal with it more effectively. So I think that can be a success preparing our students. I think that I've always believed in encouraging the students to find their own way of expressing their values. In Stanford, I was deeply involved in the social entrepreneurship program. And one of the things we urged was for people to think about starting businesses that served both social needs and were economically successful. And I think we stretched the creativity of many of those people, and they went on to found businesses which fulfilled that dual purpose in a way that most companies do not. It was 3 graduates, actually, they were after I left Stanford, but 3 graduates founded the B Corp movement, 3 Stanford MBAs who came out of this culture, which encouraged people to think about being a social entrepreneur. So I think those are successes as well. But maybe on the days that I'm more discouraged, I count up the number of students that I've taught that have ended up in jail. Fortunately, not too many of them.
And you don't blame yourself for those cases,
No, I
right,
don't blame
Kirk?
myself. I find ways of convincing myself that they were bad apples and that nothing that we were able to do or could have done would affect them.
Yeah, Kirk, I would want to continue this kind of thought about personal values and being able to express them. But there are so many questions, and I want to get through as many as I can. So we'll be going from one topic to another topic. I hope you don't mind.
I'll try to be.
Rowie
I'll try to be
Dakis
shorter.
asks a very concrete question. Yeah, Rowie Dakis asks, what is the most effective way to restore your organization's reputation after corporate misconduct? So effective ways of restoring reputation.
Well, unfortunately, I think it's by replacing the leadership. I think when you've had a scandal, the individual who either was the cause of it or who tolerated it or whose sloppy management practices permitted it has to be replaced, because first of all, they're not likely to do a good job if they try again. And secondly, replacing them is one of the clearest signals to an organization that that behavior was not acceptable. So I think leadership heads have to roll when you are replacing, when you're trying to recover from a scandal. And in most of the major scandals, the CEO and a variety of other executives have been fired, have been replaced. And I think that's the first step. The second step is hiring someone to fill those senior management positions that believes very differently and will express very strongly the values, the commitment to management have been replaced. Most of the engineers at VW have been replaced after the Dieselgate scandal. The senior officials and many officials at Boeing have been replaced after the mismanagement of the 737 jet, which they had 2 crashes because of faulty procedures in installing new software. British Petroleum cleaned house after the Deepwater Horizon blowout in the Gulf of Mexico because there was a culture which ignored safety, and they needed to change it dramatically. And but you know, there are several steps. You've got to take a definite stand on the leadership. You've got to be open about why it occurred, let the public know, have great transparency. You've got to take decisive action that everybody in the organization and outside finds credible, that you're going to behave differently in the future. And then you've got to follow through. You know, the Wells Fargo case is very discouraging because even though they fired 5,300 salespeople, just in the last month, they've had to fire another 150 individuals who falsified documents under the pandemic laws to get government money that they were not entitled to. And you say, how can they have another 150 after they had this huge scandal 5 years ago? So that's discouraging. And that's a lack of follow through in a very, you know, that was necessary.
That's a wonderful business ethics case to teach in that regard. So how culture can be oppressive for individuals. Yes. There's a question from Ben Tianki, our friend. He says, given the rush to get vaccines out during the pandemic, so this has to do with the current situation, what is your assessment of the apples, the barrels, and the orchard in the global pharmaceutical industry? The Philippines was just just signed to order vaccine 2.6 million doses from AstraZeneca. Are we in good shape to have good decisions from the pharma leaders on giving us good vaccines? What should we look out for?
Well, prior to the pandemic, I think I had a very skeptical view of the pharmaceutical industry. There were too many scandals involving the off-purpose selling of drugs. You had the major scandal in the United States over opiates and the Sackler family, which owned the company that produced opiates, and they were being prescribed in large doses for people who became addicted on them. And the company did not sort of see that pattern and act on it. And that was not just Purdue Pharmaceuticals, but it was also Johnson & Johnson, a company with a great reputation that had that scandal. It has paid millions of dollars as penalties for over-prescribing, over-distributing such drugs as well. Coming into the pandemic, there's immense amount of money being thrown at these new drugs. And the United States government has invested in the three that are being discussed about $1 billion apiece in each of those, and many other people have invested in them as well. The companies now appear to have had the right motivation to get it out as fast as possible. I'm watching how they will price and distribute it. There were not prior agreements in many cases about the pricing or the way of distributing the drugs. And so will, for example, the drugs all go to the developed countries rather than to poorer countries around the world? And how will the companies indeed price those pharmaceutical, those treatments for COVID? So there is a lot of questions still to be answered about corporate behavior in this regard. I suppose the one thing that gives some confidence is there are so many journalists and so many government officials examining exactly how this is being done that we will at least know what decisions they're making and be able to openly debate and perhaps pressure them if they appear to be improper kinds of decisions.
The situation is so complex, it can be overwhelming what different factors and what different players to consider in making those decisions. Yes, it requires so much wisdom. Yes. If I can shift to another question, I like that more questions are coming in. Bea de Ocampo asks, Dear Kirk, you have done a lot of consultancy to companies. I wonder if you experienced the use of fake news within organizations as an easy way out for some individuals to advance their own purposes. If ever, what would you advise about this? So the use of fake news, I suppose this might be related to your depiction of the intrapreneur. What do you think, what advice would you give in that regard?
Well, there's so many difficult ethical questions about the sharing of information. Let's say that your boss or your division is reporting up the line and saying there's a 75% chance of landing a big contract, and the chance is no more than 25% of getting that. That's fake news in a way, that kind of information. We actually have a case, that not in our book, but there is a very good case on that dilemma faced by employees within a particular division, knowing that the general manager of the division was overstating the future opportunities that division had. So I think that's an ethical dilemma in terms of sharing information. Another is an individual is covering up their mistakes by not revealing something. Perhaps it's, in Silicon Valley, we often talked about whether you revealed that your development process was either on time or behind time. And at what point do you have to admit it's behind time? We've got a great case on just simply shipping product. At what point do you admit to the customers who's expecting delivery on December 1 that he or she is not going to get it until January 1? So there's an information ethics question around that is very difficult. There are some cases where, tying to the broader problem of fake news, companies have said, I'm not going to reveal this problem we've got internally, because you know how the press overreacts to news that maybe we're having problems in the drug development or we might not ship something on time. So therefore we'll hide that information because we don't expect to be treated fairly by the press. So that distrust of the press and frankly overeagerness of the press sometimes is a difficult ethical quandary, to a dilemma to deal with.
Kirk, your inputs are so valuable that these are already cases that we can use in our classes.
One thing, John, you know that much of my career, given all of these involvements with companies and teaching, one of the things I've done, and I urge any of the people on this call, every course I've ever taught, I have assigned a paper, which is the student is to write a paper of an ethical dilemma they've faced in business or in their professional jobs, or that perhaps their parents have faced or whatever. They can disguise the case so we don't get into confidentiality issues. But I learned from those cases so much about how these problems really are encountered. Now, for a long time, I kept every case, and I have about 3,000 cases that students have written in my file cabinet here. So occasionally I dip in and learn from rereading a few of those about the nature of the dilemmas and how they face real people in organizational settings.
Thank you, Kirk. How time flies so fast when it's a good discussion, Kirk. I would have wanted to spend more time asking some questions. May we ask if it's possible for us to send additional questions for you to be able to continue interacting with our participants? Is
Certainly.
that okay?
I would be glad to. And I mentioned to you that you can distribute the slides or use the recording so people can have access to the slides. Or if people want to write me, if they go to, let's see the best way, K.O. Hanson with an O, Hanson, at SCU, that's Santa Clara University, .edu, SCU.edu. I would be glad to answer questions. Or if you like, you can write Professor Boulong at Ateneo, and he and I are in touch frequently. So that's another
Thank you,
strategy.
Kirk. Thank you, Kirk. Wonderful, delightful presentation, and very. I mean, the material that we've discussed can already be used for classes. So we're grateful for the concreteness and the practicality of the advice.
Very good.
And
I want to thank you, John, for a good discussion, and the organizers of the conference. As you know, you and I have run several conferences together the last 3 or 4 years. These are really important opportunities to learn from each other. And the sponsors of this conference successfully going online to make this happen is really a contribution.
yes, wonderful, Kirk. Yeah. And Kirk, can I point this out that we're branching out in this regard in the Philippines? Your audience now is far broader than just business ethics teachers from Manila.
Yes.
So we have participants from the different provinces. You've been to Cebu and you've been to other provinces in the Philippines. So we're expanding our reach in the Philippines. So your agenda for world domination continues.
Well, I will say that my co-author, Mark Epstein, would want me to emphasize He's not a business ethics teacher. He's an accounting professor. And he's always looked at these difficult questions from the place of accounting. And he's the one who believes so strongly there isn't a business discipline in which these issues don't arise. And I hope that came across today in our discussion.
Yes, that did. I think we successfully did that. Good. Anne, can I transfer the attention to you?
Yes. All right. So thank you, everyone. On behalf of the organizing committee of the 8th National Business and Management Conference, I would like to express our appreciation by presenting this digital certificate to Professor Hanson.
Thank you.
The certificate of appreciation is awarded to Professor Kirk O. Hanson for delivering the keynote address titled Business Ethics in the Next Normal during the 8th National Business and Management Conference held last November 27 to 28, 2020 via Zoom video conferencing. The theme of the conference is Reimagining the Next Normal, Business and Management in the Philippines During Times of Uncertainty. Signed, Dr. Emelina Sarial, Dr. Antonio M. Lopez, and Dr. Oscar Bulaong Jr. Again, thank you very much, Professor Hanson, for being with us today.